Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to the ghoulish part of Victober. So towards the end of Victober, I always like to start reading the rather more sinister stories if I can, if I have picked any. And I think it just lends so much to that late October feel. Of course, here in Australia, it is spring. So it's just the days are getting longer, they're warmer, all the flowers are out. So it's not quite as Halloweeny and autumnal as some of the northern hemisphere countries are enjoying. But I always feel like it's great, like atmospheric time to read some fabulously Gothic and fabulously sensationalist novels for Victober. Now, of course, I will be reading Dracula. So you can't get more pop culture horror than Dracula, which is always wonderful. I am thoroughly excited to start reading this one. It looks particularly ghoulish from this cover alone, but it was read last year in Victober by many other Victober readers, and I am very excited to read it, mainly because it came so highly recommended. So I think this is going to be such a fun read for late Victober. Another more classic Victober choice for this kind of ghoulish section is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I love Frankenstein. I cannot get enough of Frankenstein. I have quite numerous different volumes of Frankenstein. It is one of the very few books that I actually collect. I'm very picky, but I do have some very beautiful editions. This one is the olive edition of Frankenstein with that glorious hand and lightning bolt on the cover. But it is a very, very interesting book because it basically asks us to view the monstrosity of the human nature within ourselves. And that is something that I suppose we always put the monster in the other and not within us. So it's just something that's quite interesting. And it's written by a woman in 1818 was when she first wrote it. It was published a little bit later. So it's kind of on the cusp. It's not really a true Victorian novel. It was published during the Regency period, but it is one that I highly, highly recommend. Next is, of course, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This one has qualities of ghoulishness, you could say. It's not, I think the best movie was a more recent adaptation with Colin Firth and Ben Barnes. That's the one I think paid homage best to the book. But it's basically about a young man who is told, he's artistically beautiful, he's the most beautiful young man they've ever seen, and his fear is aging. And so he basically makes a pact with the devil never to age. And that is after he is painted by one of his very good friends, Basil, and the painting of him actually receives all the strains of his debauchery, let's say, and all the different things that happen to Dorian and what he does choose to do with his life now that he cannot age, is basically portrayed in the portrait and not himself. And so it's this really interesting question of art, portraiture, and also within ourselves and how we view ourselves. So he's always viewing this painting as an extension of himself. And it's just brilliant. The ending was amazing. I loved it. But yeah, so this one's a really good one. It really is another internal question, which I think what so many Victorian Gothic novels do so well is that they're actually trying to ask us to question not only society, but different elements of society and ourselves. What is the wrong within our society? I don't have a copy, but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde plays very well into that idea that I just discussed with Dorian Gray. It's kind of looking at this duality of the human psyche, and it does it so horribly well. It is a very good short read as well. So it's a good one to get into if you do ever want to pick up a wonderful Victorian short read. Another one, of course, is The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Now, this is a very hard one I find for people to get into. It's not an enjoyable read by any extent of the imagination. It is basically looking at the very dark effects of colonialism, of British colonialism in Africa. And that, of course, is interesting to be coming from an Englishman of the time when the British Empire during the late Victorian period was considered such a jewel of the world, and it was this big international power. but it was starting to see the cracks and fissures coming into that, you know, this great empire. And this is brilliant because it's about a man who basically is employed to find another man who, from, I think it's from the Dutch trading group, and they go deep into the heart of the Congo. And as they go further into the Congo, they kind of realize this land is not theirs. It's nothing that they recognize. They feel completely othered and isolated. Another element that appears quite frequently in Gothic fiction. And it is very much about the othering of other countries and cultures. And they find this man who's been completely devoted himself to an African style of living. And it's something that they cannot recognize because obviously colonial powers basically come in and they lord over and they try to control other nations, peoples, and anywhere that they think that they have power and right. So it's basically showing how wrong it is for the white man to be entering this country that is not theirs, and it's something that is alien to them, and it's something that really they shouldn't be there. And it's like, I think it's a really interesting book for that in itself. But it's one that I understand is quite hard to get into because it is very dry, if we say that, and very strange. Dry, strange, and very internal. So it is like a strange, almost moving towards a modern idea of Gothic, where it's a very internalized thought process. But yes, it is still an interesting read, for one that if you would like to read a kind of colonial Gothic. Two late Victorian horror reads, both I have not read. I am considering reading these as well, but I just really want to read Dracula first. And they are these two books from the beautiful Penguin English Library. First is The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, and this one here is The Beetle by Richard Marsh. This one actually outsold Dracula at the time, so I think it's quite interesting. But this one's a bit on mesmerism, because in the late Victorian period there was this, obviously during the Victorian period and beforehand, there was this idea of science being king and capital and everyone wanting to do scientific endeavors. But this is kind of like a weird science, so it's like mesmerism and how that kind of like deals and dwells into our society and manners. And this one is almost looking at the evils of everyday life and how this kind of deep abiding evil resides within our everyday living. Obviously that's within everyday Victorian living, not currently, although there are very good Gothic novels coming out about current society. But these two I was really interested in picking up. They did a few other ones for this series at the time. I think it's about last year or the year before when they Penguin released these versions. But otherwise, very interesting reads. If you want something more in the horror genre rather than the Gothic, these ones are probably very good to pick up. And lastly, I was very lucky when I was starting out my Victorian studies at university. Penguin handy-dandy released a series of Victorian bestsellers, most of them being sensationalist novels. So of course we have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, one that I highly recommend. It's very, very good, not in the way of more ghoulish, but it's all about secrets and mysteries, which is very interesting to see, and also how they dealt with it at the time. So it was an extensive series. I did only buy a few, the ones that really truly interested me. But if you can see, they actually published 10. So they list the 10 books that they did publish from the Victorian bestsellers, and it's just such a fascinating series. So if you can't get your hands on the series, I recommend at least finding the list and seeing different Victorian bestsellers that were obviously fascinated and captivated the audience of the time. So the ones I have are Paul Clifford by Edward Butler Linton. This one's quite an interesting one. So by day, he's a fashionable Victorian gentleman, and by night he's a highwayman that robs people. So I'm not sure if it lends into the Robin Hood vibe as such. It's a bit more sinister than that. So I do find it very fascinating indeed. Of course, they had to throw in a Wilkie Collins because he was quite like popular at the time and really brought in this really fascinating idea of mystery, crime and ghosts. But you have The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Also The Woman in White is very good. That's a very good ghost story if you did want to read a ghost story during the time. But The Moonstone's more about a crime mystery, which is really good fun. Next we have The String of Pearls, The Origin of Sweeney Todd. So this is the book that basically inspired the story and the song of Sweeney Todd. So yeah, it's quite gruesome and grisly, but otherwise very Victorian in its sensibilities. But one that I have yet to read. I haven't read this one yet, mainly because I'm slightly dreading it, but by all reports it is very good. And the last two I cannot help but laugh because they're not quite Victorian, but they still were popular during the Victorian time. They're more of a Regency publication, and one that is talked about a lot in Jane Austen, and that is The Monk by Matthew Lewis and The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. And both of these are a bit more of the very highly Gothic nature and people doing very naughty things, which is always quite funny. But these are two books that I just had to pick up because, I mean, if they're mentioned by Jane Austen and there was such an obsession around them at the time, it's something that I definitely want to discover and read and thoroughly enjoy, kind of having this very meta mention of these Gothic novels. So the next three don't quite fit into the Victober categories, mainly because they are books written by people who do not live in England or Ireland or Scotland at the time, but they're still written during the era and they are still incredibly fascinating. So the first one I recommend is Catherine Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper and Select Writings. This is by Virago publication. I think they've got a similar edition out, not quite the same design. This one is stunning. I loved it. But also the story itself is quite psychologically thrilling, and it's really interesting because it's looking at the oppression of women. So it's in the very early 1900s, just before Queen Victoria passed away. But this is a really, really fascinating collection of stories written by a woman who feels very stifled by the society in which she lives. Next, of course, is the great American Gothic writer during the mid-1800s, and that is Edgar Allan Poe. I always recommend reading The Tales of Mystery and Imagination. I think it's a really fascinating collection, and it just has some of his most famous stories in here. But it's one that I highly recommend, and if you can find some amazing editions, this is like the Black Edge edition, and it just lends itself to such wonderful Gothicness. It's just beautiful. And lastly, for those who like the kind of Gothic horror weird, I definitely recommend Sheridan Le Fanu in A Glass Darkly. He is a French writer, more of a French Gothic writer, but his short stories are exceptionally weird and exceptionally strange. It was very tough reading this one, but at the same time, because it is so weird and because things are happening that you don't quite understand what's going on, it's really freaky. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading this, and it's one that I definitely recommend if you like kind of the weird H.P. Lovecraft style writing horror weird, but it is really fascinating nonetheless. All right, so I hope you are inspired to read some Victober novels if you have yet to pick them up. If you are planning to read something gothically, mysteriously, wonderfully sensationalist in the last part of Victober, let me know and I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments. But until next time, happy reading. Bye.